American Football Stories is brought to you by Coach Paint. Coach Paint is a great tool that allows us to add graphics to player highlight clips similar to the graphics you see on TV. Coach Paint offers the ability to clearly tellustrate video while increasing retention of information in a shorter amount of time. Up your game with Coach Paint today.
What time is it? Game time! It's gonna be special. They gonna talk about this forever.
Welcome to American Football Stories.
Puts his head down, crashes and spins, and dives. Touchdown!
Bringing together the many perspectives that make up college football in the NFL.
Football is one of the greatest sports ever invented.
From players and coaches.
Believe, baby, believe, baby.
Hey, we playing to win right here, fellas.
To the front office and scouts.
The public is finally beginning to catch up, but they don't even know half the truth.
Us against the world, let's get it.
Your hosts, Robert Parker and Nick Knudsen, bring you American Football Stories.
Welcome to the American Football Stories podcast, brought to you by Coach Paint. Today is June 2nd, 2021. My name is Nick Knudsen, joined as always by my co-host Robert Parker. Hey, Rob, today we've broken down the Big Ten, we've broken down the SEC, and we've broken down the ACC schedules. Today is for the Big 12. We open up on Friday, September 3rd, with South Dakota traveling to Kansas in the first Big 12 game of the season. Seemed to watch Big Kansas play on the first night of the season last year, and that was about the only time I tuned into Kansas after getting crushed by Coastal Carolina, which at the time I was like, how embarrassing that you're getting destroyed by Coastal Carolina. Didn't realize how good Coastal was, but it was also Kansas was that bad. It was so Les Miles is out. You got Lance Leopold coming in, and I gotta say, bringing what would he bring, like 6 or 7 transfers from that Buffalo roster who were the favorites in the MAC. I mean, unfortunately for Buffalo, sorry to see that happen for Buffalo because that roster's heavily depleted on that. But hey, the Jayhawks made a fantastic hire in Lance Leopold, in my opinion. I can't say enough. You're not going to see the impact this year, in my opinion, but I think 3 years down the road, there's no reason Kansas can't be a bowl team. Like we're talking 6-6 on a semi-regular basis, right?
Yeah, I think this is a great scenario that we mentioned with other teams as well, Nick. We talked about not being the doormat of your conference. And we talked about the Rutgers of the world, in the Big Ten. We talked about, the Arkansas. Even though Sam Pittman had a great year last year, but for the most part, Arkansas was one of those teams being the doormat of the SEC. So if Lance Leopold can come in and kind of change this Kansas team around and just be competitive, that's what we're looking for. We thought Les Miles would come in and do that just with his pedigree, but for some reason it didn't translate on the field out there. In Kansas. So I love Lance Leopold. I love the hire. I love the fact that he's bringing his guys, from Buffalo, and that's going to help the continuity and the chemistry of things moving forward. So I'm right there along with you, Nick. I really think, in the next, 3 years, you can kind of see a transformation of this program moving forward.
Yeah, Leopold is, for those of you who don't know, I mean, he crushed it in Division III, I believe, before he came to Buffalo. Like I'm talking about national championships. Like the guy knows how to coach. So, and Buffalo's not exactly a storied history there. I know they've had a couple good teams over the last decade, but man, good. He basically rebuilt that Buffalo program after they fell off post Turner Gill era. I believe they had a couple good teams with Turner Gill and then kind of fell off again. Leopold came in and built that back up. Great hire by Kansas, though. All right, Rob, let's go to Saturday, September 4th. Stanford and Kansas State will meet at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas. Just an intriguing matchup here. Stanford's breaking in a new quarterback here. Kansas State, always pretty tough. They've had a good run the last couple of years where they pull an upset or two off, but they haven't quite put it together consistently. I just think this is an interesting week 1 matchup between two programs that tend to I'd say they side on the side of overachieving in their conference most years, Rob.
Yeah, I tell you what, this is a great game. Coming out the gates, Stanford and Kansas State, but I definitely give the edge to Stanford in this one. Kansas State, just like you said, they've kind of been consistent year in and year out, at least putting something on the field competitively to watch. But I just really like Stanford in this one early in the year.
Oklahoma goes to Tulane in New Orleans, Ullman Stadium. That's an interesting road trip right there. Not entirely sure why they're doing that, but they're doing it. So we get to see Spencer Rattler and the OU Sooners. A lot of hype around Heisman National Championship talk. So that'll be a good look at the Sooners early on ABC. Tulane's been a good program, not great, I would say, but good in the American Athletic Conference. If I don't expect Oklahoma to struggle with this matchup, Rob. Not a whole lot to say on it outside of just something to keep an eye on. West Virginia goes to Maryland. Ask Texas how Maryland plays on opening weekends. But I think this is an important program building game for both teams. You got Loxley and Neil Brown heading into their third year at each program. Obviously, the second year is kind of a wash for both. But you got Taulia Tagovailoa back from Maryland. West Virginia, they've kind of been like a middling program. Can they take the next step this year? That'll be a good one to watch. But Rob, the two that I'm really intrigued by are in the state of Texas in the evening at 4:30. You got to kick off 4:30 Eastern. You got to kick off with Louisiana at Texas. Steve Sarkisian's first game, but a lot of that roster's coming back for the Raging Cajuns. Billy Napier, definitely something to make Texas sweat. And Texas Tech goes to Houston. Dana Holgerson, bit of an underachieving stretch so far of his tenure with the Houston Cougars. Can they get off to a fast start? Texas Tech, Matt Wells, a little bit on the hot seat. Replaced the defensive coordinator last year. We're going to see a little bit of a different look out of Texas Tech this year. How do you feel about those Texas games, Rob?
Yeah, just like you said, this is the first chance we get to see Sark out there, in Texas, being the head coach out there. I think they have a dark horse Heisman candidate trophy, award winner, and Bijan Robinson, the running back that's coming back off his amazing freshman year. So we know Sark can call plays. We know Sark can, put his players in the right position. But for some reason with this Texas program, we just haven't seen the tradition that we used to see. And I think, outside the state of Texas, I think, Texas on a national scale is pretty irrelevant right now. I'm sharing those same sentiments that Paul Feinbaum shared early in the week in regards to the Texas program. So I hope Sark can kind of get this program turned around because, with Texas being back nationally relevant, it just makes football that much bigger and better. But I think he gets the job done. But just like you said, I don't think it's going to be a cakewalk going against the Raging Cajuns.
Yeah, a little bit of a could be a little bit of a cheap and easy victory for them though in week one that people get excited about, but then you stop and go, all right, it's kind of a lose-lose for them in a way because if they win big, it's going to be like, well, it's just Louisiana, and if they don't, then they'll say, well, they're struggling with Louisiana. So it's a little bit of a lose-lose, but chance to make a statement for sure because I'll tell you, Rob, week 2 doesn't get much easier here for Texas. So I'll get into that in a second. But first, Friday, September 10th, Kansas goes to Coastal Carolina. Reference that game already. This time it's in Conway, South Carolina. Not a lot of high hopes there for the Kansas Jayhawks, in my opinion. You got Tulsa going to Okie State. We saw them play them tough last year. Iowa State, big fan of that game the last few years. That's been a fun one to watch. Obviously, we didn't get to do it last year, but whenever they do play, tends to be a lot of fun. Cal TCU, did anybody order that Cheez-It Bowl rematch? That's a fun one on September 11th. Or by fun, I mean if you like watching a lot of defense from a couple of years ago. Texas at Arkansas, Razorback Stadium. They're not doing a neutral site game for that one, Rob. That's an actual neutral. That's an actual home and home right there. And that Texas Arkansas game in Iowa State are the two I really want to zone in, Rob. First off, the Cyclones. I mean, we got not only borderline top 5 expectations for Iowa State. I love what Matt Campbell's building at Iowa State, but you're freaking crazy if you think they're a top 5 team. That's my opinion right now.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Nick. I know they're bringing a lot of pieces back on both sides of the ball. They're bringing Brock Purdy back, the quarterback, who didn't have a tremendous season this past year, but with the COVID protocols and the shortened season and everything, that definitely had an impact on a lot of players, which we saw firsthand. But they're not a top 5 program. But I do like what Matt Campbell is doing with the program and the trajectory that it has moving forward. So I think we saw Iowa State knock off Oklahoma, and I think if they can kind of continue and build on that success moving forward, then maybe they can shoot up in a top 5, top 10 nationally program. But I just don't see it for them now.
We also saw them lose to Oklahoma too.
Yep.
Which people who love Iowa State, they don't want to talk about the loss to Oklahoma, but they did beat. The last couple of years we got a couple wins over Oklahoma. I get it. Very exciting times for Iowa State football, but you beat up on an Oregon team that really kind of was lucky to be in the Fiesta Bowl. You and I love the Ducks program, Rob. It's no disrespect to Oregon, but I mean, really was in the Pac-12 title because Washington had COVID and they didn't get to play. Well, in fairness, they didn't get to play Washington. They could have earned their spot in the Pac-12 title, but they got to the Pac-12 title because they didn't. Washington couldn't field a team for either game. They beat up on USC. They get to that Fiesta Bowl, and then Iowa State makes work of them, which I was still surprised about. I thought Oregon was going to handle that game. Not the case. Iowa State, they tend to surprise, but when you're talking about top 5, Rob, we're talking about like Ohio State, Bama, Clemson. Like Iowa State's not the next name out of my mouth on that. It just doesn't sound right to me. I'll give you top 15 for preseason, but they got to earn their way into that top 5 conversation for me. And beating Iowa week 2 will certainly help. What about Arkansas though, hosting Texas? Because I'll tell you what, Arkansas may have not been on the record books the prettiest season for the Hogs, but in terms of if you watch that team from the last few years to that how competitive they were week in and week out, my God, they were one of my favorite watches in the SEC last year. I loved watching that Arkansas team, and Pittman's just the man. He just seems like a fun dude. Like that program's got totally different energy since he took over. How much could he ruin Sark's opening year if the Hogs just laid on the Longhorns in week 2? I still think Texas probably has more talented roster, Rob, but what's that going to be like in the national media conversation? Because I gotta say, I like the Sarkisian hire. I'm not nearly as high on it as the national media just gave it. What piece of anything in our society today gets you near unanimous approval like Sark's hire to Texas has? I mean, how many critics have you heard of the hire? There's not a lot of criticism about that hire. And I understand the logic of it, but you paid Tom Herman a good amount of money to go away to hire a guy who could be a good coach, but I don't think he's a sure thing out there. But I don't know, man. I think I'm trying to say this game is it's important for both, but it's far more important for Sark than it is for Pittman.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that, Nick. I tell you what, this game could shape out being a blemish on Sark's, record early on in his career. We know what Sam Pittman did with Arkansas this past year, especially on the defense side of the ball. And I can see this game actually coming down to a defensive battle. Texas is breaking in a new coach in Sarkisian. They're breaking in a new quarterback. Sam Elliker is not there anymore. I know they have the Heisman hopeful and Bijan Robinson at the running back position, but I think Sam Pittman and this Arkansas team will key in on him and make someone else beat them. So with that being said, I really like Arkansas going into this game. Maybe not ultimately to come out with the win, but to keep it competitive and to have Texas sweating at the end. And I wouldn't be surprised if Arkansas win this game against Texas, even though Texas having the better roster with more talent. But just like you said, I really haven't heard any critics in regards to Sark getting the hire out there in Texas. But it could really shape up to Sark being the new Tom Herman in a sense, if you ask me, because I think for Texas moving forward in the Big 12, of course, they have to beat their rival in Oklahoma. And I think they have to rattle off 10-win seasons consistently. And that's that's the tradition that, we're used to seeing from Texas, and the multiple players being drafted in the first couple rounds, in the NFL draft, just the tradition with the running backs, the tradition with the quarterbacks and the receivers and the defense. So I think if Texas can get back to that, then we can kind of put them back on the national scale. But for right now, I really just think they're the talk of the town in the state of Texas and nowhere else.
Well, would you say I would disagree with that point, because on Twitter they dominate. Like, I have a pretty eclectic Twitter feed where I try to follow a lot of the country. I don't just try to hone in on one spot. My personal Twitter feed, probably it's more Florida Gator stuff, but on the American Football Stories Twitter feed, we try to follow everything so that we don't get, we get to see the big news everywhere. But I see a lot of Texas, man. And Sark has certainly put an energy into the program that has been lacking the last couple of years. And by the way, similar to what the energy was when Herman took over. Let's not kid ourselves. Everyone just wants to dismiss her. There was a lot of energy with Tom Herman coming in, and very popular hire, highly sought after coach. I would say a much more sought after coach than Sarkisian. Herman was like the most popular coach in that cycle. LSU wanted him. I mean, LSU settled for Ed Ogeron because they couldn't get Herman. So I mean, Herman was a big name coming in there, and unfortunately it just didn't work out for, you could probably point to like 100 different reasons, but Sark's coming in. There's a lot of problems on, even off the field, they got the whole controversy with the fight song and everything like that. I mean, even something like that is derailed his time there, where I feel like Sark's got a chance if they come in, they handle Louisiana, and then they go up and just, I don't care if you beat Arkansas by a field goal, you find a way to win, you get that 2-0 start on a semi-national stage on both of those games. I mean, they will be on national TV, but I'm saying, like, people will be they're not the top billed game of the day in either instance, but good games. You got a chance to get off to a very quick start here if you're Sark, especially if you look good. So, but then at the end of the day, you're going to have to stop and pause and be like, well, it's Louisiana, and well, Arkansas is what? The fifth best team in the SEC West, fourth best team in the SEC West. But Texas hasn't taken care of those teams the last several years. I made the joke about Maryland. Maryland's wasn't very good after beating Texas. Like, Texas needs to take care of business, and if Sark can get them off to a fast start, that's going to be incredibly important. All right, we'll try to. We zoned in on Texas early, but a lot to say about Texas early here. Saturday, September 18th, Virginia Tech at West Virginia. Old Big East matchup right there. Another old matchup here. Nebraska at Oklahoma. You got the AD for Oklahoma releasing statements that they are bitterly disappointed about it being out at noon on Fox, and just that the whole, we'll get to that in a second here. But I mean, other than that, you got Oklahoma State going to Boise State, and just more of an interest of note, Iowa State going to UNLV to play in the new stadium in Vegas, Allegiant Stadium, with the Raiders. That'll just be an interesting look. Probably not an interesting game, but Okie State on the blue turf, best game of the day by far, in my opinion, in this grouping. But let's go back to the top here and talk about Nebraska at Oklahoma. Rob, obviously you and I are two people that we respect the tradition and history of college football, but unfortunately that's the only place where Nebraska stands in terms of relevance is in the past. And this game, there has been more whining and moaning about this game. That's something that's going to probably turn out to be a 4-touchdown game that I've ever heard my entire life, man. I mean, they're talking about Nebraska potentially trying to get out of the game, and now they're angry that it's at noon, like it's this big premier game across the country. Like, I think Fox is putting a lot of things at noon. They put Ohio State and Oregon at noon. Like, I don't know what Oklahoma wants here. I'm not sure. Like, I think they're very much living in their own world with, like, the level of self-importance that it's being placed on this game.
Yeah, and especially for the matchup. I mean, if it was a traditional matchup with both of these two teams, were at their peak, I could kind of understand the, playing in that noon slot, but we've seen tremendous matchups at that noon slot. So I just think, Nebraska just needs to get over themselves. Oklahoma just needs to get over themselves and just, just suck it up and just go ahead and lay it all out on the field. And I tell you what, this could be a big spot for Nebraska and Scott Frost moving forward if they can somehow come up with the upset. And we talked about, Nebraska on the Big Ten episode where they really have a difficult schedule. And this is one of those games. So if they can come out with the upset in this game, I think, all that talking that we're hearing now, I think it's simmered down, especially from the Nebraska side.
Hey, Nebraska was one of those teams that they were so dominant when we were kids. I just hated them every week. And, but the more I've gotten to know their program and their fan base and everything. I got a couple good friends who are Nebraska fans. Got to go out to a game to Lincoln a few years ago. Like, man, that is a fan base that is just so desperate to get back into it. And of course they should be. Nebraska fans are some of the best in the country. And to have to deal with such mediocre to below average football on a yearly basis is crazy. If you would have told me this is where they would have been in what are we going into, 4 or 5 of Scott Frost? 4? Year 4 of Scott Frost, like I would have been stunned. So unless he's got some magic up his sleeve and there are some guys on this roster we just don't know about yet, I don't have high hopes for Nebraska going in. And I think Oklahoma is like peak Oklahoma right now, raring for a title run, unless Spencer Rattler, who we did not watch a whole lot of last year because I just didn't feel like Oklahoma got those like primetime games. Like I say I assume you didn't watch. How many Oklahoma games you watch last year? Like really start to finish, like really watch?
Pretty much just one, probably that Ohio State game, bits and pieces throughout the season, but from beginning to end. You
mean the Cotton Bowl?
Yeah,
Oklahoma, Florida, Florida game. Yeah. I mean, but again, Florida. I know Oklahoma fans get angry, but Florida was not. Florida had like 20 players missing from that game.
Yeah.
But Oklahoma played great too. Nothing to take away from, but. I'd like to watch more Spencer Rattler before I go in. Like they are a roster that is very much ready to contend for a national title, but Spencer Rattler has to live up to that hype too. He's got to live up to it. The last one too, Okie State at Boise State. Rob, I just think Okie State's one of those teams where it's like they always have like that one or two losses keeping them from doing something. Like this is a game they got to take care of, but going up on a night game on the blue carpet. First off, kudos for going to Boise. You don't see a ton of big programs do that. Florida State was supposed to last year. Obviously, we know what happened with that. But Boise State gets to actually host one of these. This is good to see. But how do you feel about the Cowboys' chance going up facing the Broncos?
Before I dive in, I would definitely be remiss not to mention I know you're saying kudos to Oklahoma State for going on the blue turf, but how about just kudos to the Boise State program for always having these type of games? You've seen them playing these
road neutral
Power 5 conference games, and it's just they're one of the programs who's not afraid to kind of compete and go on the road or have someone come to their house and play. So let's give Boise State some love, and we love watching games on that blue turf as well. But just for the game, in fact, I think, Spencer Sanders is coming back, the quarterback from Oklahoma State. I know they're replacing Tylan Wallace and Chuba Hubbard, but it always seems like Gundy just has a 1,000-yard receiver just waiting in the mix, waiting there. So I think Spencer Sanders is probably one of the better quarterbacks in the Big 12 conference. So I think he goes out on the road and get the job done. So I got Oklahoma State in this one. But once again, I just have to show love for that Boise State program for always scheduling these tough games.
Yeah, definitely. One of the better. I mean, we saw UCF for years resist that, right? Then now they might be changing philosophies a little bit with the new AD, but yeah, kudos to Boise State as well. All right, let's move on to Saturday, September 25th. We're getting through the first month of the season already. Iowa State goes down to Baylor. We saw a great game there a couple of years ago. West Virginia at Oklahoma. Let's see it again. Where are the Mountaineers? There's a chance to show that you're taking a step forward. Not necessarily win, just play tough. Kansas State at Oklahoma State. SMU at TCU. And Texas Tech at Texas. A lot of good games this weekend, Rob. I want to focus in on Iowa State at Baylor. How are we feeling heading into? I feel like they were very quiet last year under Dave Aranda in the first year. Charlie Brewer's out. I want to say he transferred to Utah. How are we feeling about year 2 of Dave Aranda in Waco?
I think he has a better year too. But once again, I really just like, what Matt Campbell was doing out there in Iowa State. And once again, Brock Purdy, this is one of those games where, you have to show what you're made of. I know he's in the talk of being a top tier quarterback, in next year's draft. So these are the games that you want to put out there on film and produce. So I give the edge to Iowa State in this one, just from the coaching standpoint and the quarterback matchup.
It'll be a tough matchup, but I want to see like this Baylor. We saw Matt Rule build that program up, left it in pretty good shape to where he picked it up from nothing. He left it in good shape. Aranda, it's a weird year, first year pandemic, but you like to see them bounce back and be a really competitive team again this year. Maybe not to that 10-win, New Year's Six bowl type caliber, but definitely improved. You got to definitely see some improvement here with Baylor. Kansas on Saturday, October 2nd, Kansas goes to Iowa State, Oklahoma at Kansas State, Baylor at Oklahoma State, and Texas at TCU are the games I like to highlight. Texas at TCU, this is a game that Texas has really struggled with, and TCU hasn't necessarily been great the last several years. One of the what the hells of the Tom Herman era that he can never seem to figure out Gary Patterson.
Yeah, it really seems like, we know TCU and Gary Patterson for being, more so of a defensive team. The last couple of years, it kind of seemed like, the defense hasn't been there. That's why you've seen the drop with TCU. But I think Gary Patterson is one of the great coaches we have in the Power 5. And I think he gets back to, playing shape and get back to having everyone in the right direction, running to the ball and everything. And once again, we talk about the Sark hire. This is one of those games that Texas have to win. We've seen Texas struggle with this matchup, in the last couple of years. So this is a big time game. Maybe not so much on the national stage because of TCU. It's not that big national, team. But this is for the interconference, for the Big 12. These are the games that Sark is going to go out there and have to win. So I think this is going to be, a really important game moving forward. For the season, to see what for both programs, the TCU and Texas. So this is definitely one of the better matchups of the weekend right here.
Yeah. Hey, Rob, I know that Gary Patterson is highly respected in the industry. I know that a lot of people, I've loved watching his teams at TCU over the years. Maybe TCU should not be Texas in terms of expectation. It's a small school. Like they obviously have a great history. I would say they've had a highly successful jump from a non-Power 5 into the Power 5 conferences. And they were highly successful before that to make the jump. So I understand why Gary Patterson, you never really hear his name come up. But when's the last time TCU's been a serious contender in the Big 12? Are we going to start to hear if they go through another 7-8 win season without being a serious contender this year? Are we going to start to hear some chatter around Gary Patterson potentially exiting in Fort Worth? We might. But I tell you what, I think Gary Patterson just loves being out there at TCU. He loves that program. He's been competitive, during his tenure. I know it's been up and down and he hasn't really won a lot, but you just don't get those quality coaches, coming around to, impact a program, you don't see those coaches falling off the trees. So when you have something good, you kind of want to keep it. And I think, TCU and Gary Patterson is there to stay for the near future. All right. And Oklahoma going to Kansas State. Any worries about that? Upset potential, look ahead game to Texas, maybe road game, or they've slipped up against Kansas State enough to where they don't look ahead on that?
Yeah, I think, Lincoln Riley and with Spencer Rattler having, the Heisman hopeful, preseason talk about him and surrounding him. And he knows he he got benched last year. Like, we have to talk about Spencer Rattler getting benched, and we're talking about him coming in the season as being, one of the front runners to win the Heisman. So I think not only will he be locked in throughout the season, I think Lincoln Riley and the whole team will be locked in throughout the season. So I don't see them going into games overlooking opponents. I think they're going to be dialed in, and they're just going to try to run the table and just try to get to that college football playoff. So I don't think this will be a trap game for them, especially knowing the implications of the season and what they can do moving forward.
Only 3 games on Saturday, October 9th, but really only one to highlight: the Red River rivalry here with Oklahoma and Texas in the Cotton Bowl, Rob. Hey, again, the one thing with the Herman era is, despite the fact that Oklahoma was clearly the better team, he always showed up and played Oklahoma tough. You knew Texas was going to be a thorn in Oklahoma's side. I don't know if this is a must-win for Sark, but good performance. You want to see a good performance out of him, because you certainly need to show that you go up against Oklahoma. But if Texas could get a win here and derail a potential national championship season in Norman, that would be an enormous victory for Coach Sark in year 1 in Austin.
It would, and I tell you, that fan base would definitely rally around Sark if that was to happen. And we talk about these rivalry games all the time. I know we talked about, Florida State and the Florida matchup. We talked about the Georgia and the Georgia Tech matchup, the South Carolina Clemson matchup, where, it's been lopsided. So in regards to this Texas Oklahoma matchup, it has been competitive, the last couple of years. You've seen that. Even when Kyler Murray was there, you kind of see Texas take him to the brink. Kyler Murray had to, go in his bag of tricks and pull out some miraculous throws and some miraculous runs in that particular game. So this rivalry has been competitive in the last couple of years, and that's what you want to see from both fan bases. If you're an Oklahoma fan base and a Texas fan base, you just kind of want to see this rivalry being competitive. And I think, Sark continues to keep the rivalry competitive. And just like you said, I don't think he has to pull out a win, but if he does and he derails, national championship expectations for the Oklahoma Sooners, I think this fan base is just going to be ravenous around Sark, and I think that's going to propel him to move forward to actually steal some of those recruits that leaves the state and goes to Oklahoma.
Saturday, October 16th, BYU goes down to Baylor. We saw a great season out of the Cougars last year. Tough matchup for Dave Aranda and the Baylor Bears. We got Iowa State at Kansas State. Kansas State keeps popping up. They got, I mean, obviously the Big 12, they all play each other, but I think Kansas State, they're just one of those wild card teams every year. So, hey, if you're top 5 Iowa State, that's no sweat going to Kansas State, right? But we've seen top teams struggle with that trip. Certainly Texas in the past, definitely Oklahoma. They've struggled. TCU goes to OU, and then I love this matchup. For whatever reason, Oklahoma State at Texas, that always ends up just being a heck of a game. Those two tend to play great games, and that's the one I'm most excited to watch on this Saturday here, October 16th. Rob, is this the year that Mike Gundy and the Cowboys, like, I know we're talking all the preseason talks about OU, but it's like you said with Spencer Sanders, like, is Spencer Sanders, like, could he potentially be the better quarterback in Oklahoma this year? We talk all about Spencer Rattler, and OU's got the national prestige, but Spencer Sanders is not. I don't think that's a ridiculous thing to say that, if Rattler doesn't take a step forward, Sanders, he's got some high-end potential, doesn't he?
He really does. And I think when it comes to comparing the two, I think I have to give the edge to Spencer Rattler because of the talent that he has around him. I think, with the loss of Tylan Wallace and Chuba Hubbard and Dylan Stoner, I think that's going to hurt, Spencer Sanders moving forward. So he might press a little bit more because a lot might be on his shoulders. He might, have to tuck and run,
which he's more than capable of doing.
He's definitely more than capable of doing. Probably one of the more athletic quarterbacks in the conference.
Country.
If we want to talk about that, and then definitely in the country on a national level. So I think he have the tools to get the job done, but I just kind of want to see how the fall camp and how everything shapes out for the pieces around him at the skill positions. But he's definitely not lacking the talent, and he's definitely a dual threat quarterback that can get the job done. So I just kind of want to see how his other position players develop more so than, Spencer Sanders.
But it's like you said, Mike Gundy knows how to produce those skill position players. So he puts them in good spots, and he can make some superstars out there in Stillwater. But I think that Okie State, they're always kind of a lurking threat. Man, I don't even know if there's a good comparison to them in any other conference, because they're kind of unique where they're always just kind of there, but they're never the serious threat. And even when they are, they seem to trip up immediately.
Yeah.
Where it's like they just never get the job quite done, or even really, I mean, how many times we even see them get to the Big 12 title game? It just doesn't, they just can't seem to quite get over that hump. But certainly an opportunity to do so this year and make some noise with that type of quarterback coming back. But hey, let's go Saturday, October 23rd. Another tough matchup. Following their trip to Texas, Okie State has to go on the road to Iowa State. And maybe I'm just describing why it's not going to happen again this year for Oklahoma State, but that could be another good one right there. Iowa State certainly had some good wins against Oklahoma State in the past. OU goes to Kansas, just pointing that out as a David and Goliath thing. Is that going to be a thing where OU puts up 70, or is Leopold going to have the Jayhawks respectable in fighting? We'll see. West Virginia at TCU, and Kansas State at Texas Tech. That's always one of those matchups too, with K-State, Texas Tech get together, where just wild games where you're not quite sure. Rob, we haven't really spent a lot of time. I kind of briefly mentioned Matt Wells might be on the hot seat this year. Things have not been great since Kingsbury left. Or really, Kingsbury was fired. Guy gets fired and hired by the NFL team. Maybe you shouldn't fire the guy, but I can understand where Texas Tech looked at the program even under Kingsbury and said, we got to make a change. But, hey, I think they're going to get more back to their roots this year as a program with that little bit of a spread, but they brought in a new defense. I think Texas Tech is going to be one of those teams that they might be a little bit – I think it's going to be a very up and down season. I don't think it's going to be enough to really definitively say Matt Wells is here to stay, which surprises me because I thought he did a very good job at Utah State before he came down to Texas Tech.
Yeah, but that's the difference, Nick. Coming from Utah State, coming into the Big 12 and playing against, the Oklahomas, the Texas of the world, even though Texas has been down, it's just like, I don't want to say it's slim pickings for recruits in the state of Texas, but when it comes to that top tier talent, you just don't get a lot of those guys going to Texas Tech. And, I know they found the gym and Patrick Mahomes. I know they had, when they had their big year with Michael Crabtree, that was a big year for Texas Tech. But they just haven't been putting it together year in and year out, being consistent. Yeah. And we know, the narrative surrounding the Big 12 as a conference is that, no one plays any defense. And Gary Patterson and TCU was the only team really playing defense, but they just couldn't, keep up on the offense side of the ball. So now you got that Oklahoma team that can play offense and play defense. So
Iowa State's played some defense
and Iowa State as well with Matt Campbell, but their offense just kind of have to get up to par. So when you have those teams playing, good on both sides of the ball, it's just so hard to be consistent and beat those teams year in and year out.
I mean, I guess if you get the right coach in, it's not like Texas Tech is. In the one sense, you would think it's kind of an easy place to recruit because you're in the state of Texas, but the state of Texas is huge, folks. And Texas Tech is way out there. I've never made the drive out there, but they're not exactly like an easy place to reach, and a little bit in the middle of nowhere from my understanding of things. But I don't think Texas Tech's one of those schools. We'll hear from them again at some point. I just think they really need. It's all about the coach for them. They got to have that right coach in there, and Mike Leach showed what was possible with that program, and then he went up to Washington State, did the exact same thing. Maybe you had a special guy at Mike Leach. You might need to bring someone back. Like, I know Kingsbury was the guy, but is there anybody else from that era we could bring back to Texas Tech to try to recapture that magic? That's what I would think if they disappoint again and Wells heads out the door. But like, I think that I love the Wells hire when they made it, and I think he's still capable of building something. And if I'm Texas Tech, I'm being patient with them and giving them another year no matter what, but they're going to want to see some improvement this year. So important year for Matt Wells down at Texas Tech. All right, let's go Saturday, October 30th, end of October here, Rob. Texas goes to Baylor. TCU at Kansas State could be an interesting matchup. Texas Tech goes to Oklahoma, and Iowa State hits the road to West Virginia and a potential upset there. Rob, we're heading into year 3 of the Neil Brown era at West Virginia. We've seen the Mountaineers play. I feel like they started off so terribly with Brown, where I think Missouri whooped them early on, and they just were struggling on offense very, very badly that first year. They really were quietly okay last year. They significantly improved, I thought, from 2019, but they got no attention nationally. West Virginia is one of those low-key programs that it's easy to overlook when they're not playing top-notch football, but great fan base, good tradition there, a lot of good teams in the last 40 years there. Neil Brown was a great hire, in my opinion, from Troy. Like, are we going to see Neil Brown turn the corner this year in year 3?
I think we will. One thing that kind of hinders West Virginia is the recruiting landscape is really not a recruiting rich ground for players. So West Virginia do a lot of their stuff through the transfer portal or JUCO guys and bringing them on board. We saw that with Will Grier when they brought Will Grier on at the quarterback position. He kind of cemented that position, and they had a tremendous year that particular year, just scoring the ball, playing good defense. So I think if Neil Brown can get it right at the quarterback position, I think we will see an improvement from West Virginia moving forward, because it just seems like they always pick up one or two pieces in the transfer portal that kind of pushes them over the edge of being a average team to a decent team. So I think Neil Brown can definitely turn the corner moving forward.
Man, when they were cooking, I'm talking about like Noel Devine was from Florida. They had a lot of guys. They would come down to Florida and pick off guys. They would come down to they were getting guys pretty much from everywhere in the Southeast, but you're right, near Pennsylvania and Ohio. You would think that with some of their tradition, they'd be able to pick off a few more top recruits in that area. But I think part of it too is like West Virginia's just been down for a few years at this point. And when you talk about competing seriously for national titles, like it hasn't happened since Rich Rod. Dana Holgerson had some fun teams, but they were like, where'd they go? Like 8-4 most of the time. Their highlight was they beat the hell out of Clemson in that Orange Bowl before Clemson really took off with Dabo. They've done some cool things in the last decade, but they haven't been consistently there for those top recruits to see. So you like to see them start to get on the map. A win over Iowa State on October 30th. That could be a nice statement victory for Neil Brown in year 3. And I don't ever discount a trip to Morgantown. I think trip to Morgantown, again, one place I have circled on my list that I very much want to get to sooner than later, by the way, it's Morgantown, West Virginia for a game. So, Rob, we might have to figure out a way to get there and see some of those see a solid West Virginia game at some point. Saturday, November 6th. All right, we're into November. Texas goes to Iowa State. Kansas State, Kansas matchup. Baylor at TCU and Okie State at West Virginia. Another tough game for Okie State. We talk about not a favorable schedule for Okie State so far, from what I'm seeing.
No.
And then the only other game, I feel like we talk about Texas a ton, Iowa State a ton, but that's the matchup of the day on Saturday, November 6th. Could be a critical matchup to decide who's going to be facing Oklahoma in the Big 12 title game.
I think, after Oklahoma, Nick, those are the two, premier teams in the conference. I know Texas is trying to get back to being, the top dog, especially with the new hire with Sark. But once again, breaking in a new coach, breaking in a new quarterback, that could be kind of detrimental for you in year 1. especially going up against the Iowa State team with Brock Purdy and Matt Campbell coming back. So just having that continuity at the head coach and the quarterback position, it helps out a lot. And, we talk about, quarterbacks and we talk about head coaches being together for some time now. And I think that just gives Iowa State the edge. But if Texas can come out with a victory in this particular game, they're definitely trending in the right direction. So if Texas can get those wins that they should, the Texas that we grew up to love, Nick, if they can get those wins that, Texas should win that game. If we can kind of see Texas getting back to that mold where they're knocking off the Iowa States, the Baylors, the West Virginians consistently, and those are games they should win year in, year out. And if you get to an Oklahoma State or, Oklahoma and you guys go back and forth, that's okay. But you have to win those games that you normally would win. And just based off being the tradition that you have at Texas, those are the toss-up games that you should come out and win. So if we can see, Sark do that in year one, I think, this Texas program is definitely going to turn the corner and head in the right direction.
I don't know about love for Texas. I may have tolerated Texas. I certainly rooted against them a whole lot because they're ranked in the top 5 during the Mac Brown era a whole lot. But I have to your point though, we have expectations for Texas, I think, which is a sign of respect. I think you expect them to be in the top tier of the Big 12 every single year, competing for titles, and they have massively underachieved for a long, long time now. And so let's go to Saturday, November 13th. You got Oklahoma going to Baylor. We've seen that be a tough game for the Sooners a couple different times. West Virginia at Kansas State, TCU, Okie State, Iowa State goes to Texas Tech. Really, we've covered most of these teams. We've covered really all the Big 12 at this point. Obviously, that OU Baylor game stands out. But if you want to talk about another game of second-tier teams, Oklahoma State pulls a couple upsets off. That TCU-Oklahoma State game could have some weight on this day. But the game that I really want to see, and we're talking about it in a national championship hunt sense, but we see Oklahoma, they go on the road to Kansas State, they go on the road to Baylor. Certainly 2 winnable games, but also 2 games we've seen Oklahoma really struggle with in the past. And I'm not in the recent past too.
Yeah.
So Oklahoma, can they survive without being tripped up? That's really the biggest piece of interest from Saturday, November 13th. Let's jump ahead another week to Saturday, November 20th. You got Baylor going to Kansas State, Iowa State at Oklahoma, probably the matchup of the year. I think this should be an early season game. I don't know why they're saving this all the way, because if this is going to be the Big 12 rematch, I mean, if they both could potentially have it locked up by this date, why would they save this for so late in the season? I don't understand that from a scheduling perspective. Oklahoma State goes Texas Tech, and Texas goes to West Virginia. Rob, the more I look at it with Iowa State, do you believe Iowa State's going to be unbeaten coming into this game against Oklahoma on November 20th?
I don't. I think they slip. I think they slip up, if not once
or twice.
Yeah. Throughout the season.
Hey, yeah. Brock Purdy's not unbeatable. That roster's not unbeatable. They got a good team, but they're not unbeatable. They're going to be fun to watch, and I think they could be close losses. I don't think anyone's going to blow them out. But Iowa State going into Oklahoma, this could be the final nail in the coffin for Iowa State in terms of getting into the Big 12 title game.
Yeah, it really could. But once again, I like the matchup just because I've been saying it, throughout the whole pod so far. Just having that continuity at the head coaching spot and in the quarterback position, Brock Purdy and Matt Campbell. So, having that experience, helps out a lot in these big time matchups. So I think, that's going to help Iowa State along the way. But, coming into this game, I think they slip up once or maybe twice. But it's definitely going to be a national game that everyone's going to have, their eyes on, because it can shake up a lot of things, especially on the college football playoff landscape.
Tough road for Iowa State is what we've gathered out of this exercise today. Tough road to get the Big 12 title game. Friday, November 26th, TCU goes to Iowa State. Again, no pushover matchup. feels like week in and week out they got a tough matchup. Kansas State goes to Texas on that Friday. On Saturday, November 27th, you got really the only game worth mentioning here. Texas Tech and Baylor's all right, but Oklahoma at Oklahoma State. Ticket prices are already over $250 for that game at a minimum. So the battle of Spencers at the quarterback position. Rob, any chance you see Oklahoma State stepping up this year and really pulling off that upset, regardless of how they do during the season?
Yeah, I just
be
don't.
Tough.
It's going to be tough. I don't see it. I really think, Lincoln Riley and Spencer Rattler is going to be locked in throughout the season. And I just they don't give anything to chance. I think they just go out there and they just, from kickoff to the end of the game, they just, 100 miles per hour, and they just try to lock up a playoff spot. And I think that's just the mentality they're going to have coming out week in and week out in the Big 12.
Oklahoma's got some interesting road games though this year. If you want to look at Baylor and Kansas State, Okie State, I mean, places they've had issues with in the past. They mostly win those games, but not exactly the smoothest path for the Sooners. I mean, you and I obviously both are pretty much on the same page with Oklahoma, though. Just a ton of confidence in what they've built up with that roster right now. But Rob, I think we walk away confirming that we like the Sooners as favorites. Iowa State is definitely a team we like, but we probably like them more like a 9-3 than the national title contender. So let's not get carried away with Iowa State in the preseason. And then other than that, a lot of middling teams vying for really who's going to take that step up. Is it going to be Texas? Is it going to be West Virginia? Is it going to be Baylor going to make that step back? I mean, Texas Tech has been a little bit down. Kansas State, is Kansas going to be mildly respectable? I mean, there's a lot of good questions heading into this Big 12 season, but everybody seems to be dwarfed by the Death Star that is the Oklahoma Sooner program right now. And every conference seems to have that right now. It's you got Alabama in the SEC, Ohio State in the Big Ten. So nothing to be ashamed of. I don't think it's a reason to knock Big 12 football because, the other Power Fives are very similar in that regard. But, man, it just feels like Oklahoma's like 5 miles out in front of the pack before the season even starts, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it seems like. I mean, I know it really seems like Oklahoma and Iowa State is like, the same thing. Like they're out in their respectful conference ahead of people. At least you have other teams in the other conference that's kind of making strides. You got, I know Alabama is the king of the crop in the SEC, but you still have Georgia. You still have Florida there. You got Clemson and you have Mac Brown. I think that's another thing that hurts the Texas fan base as well, because you had Mac Brown getting pushed out and getting fired. And now he's a top 10 team. He has a top 10 team in North Carolina. So I think that's another thing that makes this Steve Sarkisian hire a little bit more interesting, because they haven't gotten it right since, Mac Brown has left, Texas. So is Sark going to, turn it around and get it right? I think he can, especially with the talent that they have in the state of Texas. And we know what he can do as a play caller. So, but don't be surprised. Bijan Robinson, running back of Texas, Heisman hope for dark horse.
Hey, I like the Charlie Strong hire when they made it. I like the Tom Herman hire when they made it. Sark was the hire. I went, what? That's the guy you pushed out Herman for him? Really? Hey, no disrespect to Sark. I like Sark. And honestly, I've learned more about Sark since he's been hired at Texas, where I go, okay, I'm seeing the appeal. Like just how pivotal he's been with Alabama. I always look at it, just so many turnovers with assistants there that you look at it as like kind of a machine. And so I'm always cautious about how much credit I give Alabama assistants, because we've seen so many Alabama assistants go out into the world and just kind of like Kirby Smart's been good. Lane Kiffin's been good. But I mean, we watched Jim McElwain and Will Muschamp for a long time run the Florida Gator program. The Saban magic didn't wear off on them. So Saban assistant doesn't guarantee you a damn thing, but really, like, Sark did a lot of things with that offense that is quite interesting, and it will be interesting to see what he does. He's also was pretty pivotal in recruiting aspect too with Bama. So if he can, we've seen Texas pick up some steam on that trail. Let's see how they end up finishing this year, though. I think a lot of guys are sitting and waiting to say, "Show me something." So if you can pull off an upset or two and not screw around, I think it's important. Those first two games for Texas, I think, are the arguably outside of Oklahoma the most important games of the season, for the sense that you're going to be in front of a national TV audience. You better get off to a fast start. Louisiana and Arkansas, those games are critical. So a lot of interest in the Big 12 for me this year, though. We'll definitely be watching a ton of Big 12 football. And Rob, this has been a look ahead at the Big 12 schedule with the American Football Stories. We're going to send you out with a word from our sponsor, Coach Paint.
American Football Stories is brought to you by Coach Paint. Coach Paint is a great tool that allows us to add graphics to player highlight clips similar to the graphics you see on TV. Coach Paint offers the ability to clearly tell a straight video while increasing retention of information in a shorter amount of time. Up your game with Coach Paint today.
Thank you for listening to American Football Stories podcast. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, American Football Stories. We are working to grow our network on YouTube and we'd love to have you subscribe. You can find us also on Apple Podcasts, on Twitter at American FB Story, and on our website, AmericanFootballStories.com. I am Robert Parker. My co-host is Nick Knudsen. This has been another episode of American Football Stories.